which way. She's not your number one.
I don't know what somebody's watching. It sounds like Maury Povich or something. Anyway. Hello, David. How are you, sir?
I ate lunch with Joshua today. And I told him I was coming to class. He said, I'm teaching this class.
Who is Joshua?
Joshua came to
Oh,
you eating lunch with him today?
Yeah, me and him and David Moses had lunch.
Okay.
He said, I said, I'm going to Revelations class this afternoon. He said, well, who teaching in the class? I said, David Rogers. He said, David is so country. I said, he's not country, he's a cowboy. That's the difference, ain't that right?
Well, he's probably more right than he knows. But I'm not going to admit to it.
They have their 11 o'clock
Insult.
class on Tuesdays.
Yeah, no, I was there this morning. And
You didn't go to lunch with them?
he didn't say anything about it. In fact,
Oh.
when I pulled out of the parking lot, there were 3 cars, including mine. So, no, there was 3 cars, including Joshua. It was Joshua and 2 other cars. So I thought he was.
You maybe weren't invited. Ooh.
Yeah. I thought it was a conference or something. Like there was a white Mercedes, Josh car, and another car. And
Well, I was fixing to say, if y'all are paying that young man enough to drive a white Mercedes, he's doing
That
well.
was probably the other David's car. He sells them, so he might have been driving with us.
But he wasn't in class though. David, neither David Fleming wasn't in class either. So I was surprised to hear it.
Oh,
Went to lunch.
they weren't in class. They
No.
went to lunch?
Mm-hmm.
We will get started in just a minute. Wait just another minute more. Give some of our other folks another minute or so to show up.
Yeah, I was running late because there was 3 accidents on Covenant Highway.
Well, I didn't know what it was, but I got up here on the Memorial, and it was pretty well smooth sailing until I hit Memorial, and then I think I saw 3 Atlanta police with people pulled over, no accidents or anything. Then there's a motorcycle accident down here by just this side of Kroger, but it wasn't in the street. It was over on the side, but it was bumper to bumper all the way down Memorial. I don't know why it was uncommonly heavy, but it was. Anyway.
Hey, Dave.
Yes, sir.
Now you wasn't in class today, so
I didn't go. I was in the yard. And I started some work this morning that I started early, so I could take it. But David Moses, they called me and said, no,
you're supposed to invite more people. I was
Yeah.
in class today.
See, I was invited. I couldn't invite.
So why didn't you invite Ray?
I wasn't.
Why didn't you invite Ray?
My wife forget me.
Why didn't you invite Ray?
Because she says, you just invite people invite you and then you invite other people. She said that's not right. But no, they called me. They called me and said,
Using that excuse.
David called me and said, what you doing? I said, I'm in
David
the
wasn't
yard.
in class either.
He wasn't.
No.
No. Yes, he said, what you doing? I said, I'm in the yard. He said,
Both of the doghouse now.
He said, man, meet me at Eat Right. I got Josh with me. I said, Kentrell? He said, yeah. I said, all right. I'll be
Where'd
back."
you eat?
I didn't. They called me. I had just took a lunch break when they called. It was about midday. So that was
Where did y'all meet?
we went to Eat Right Jamaican restaurant, and Josh had oxtails for the first time. He loved it. Never had oxtails.
You never had, what's wrong with it?
I don't.
Okay.
He didn't
He's
grow
young.
up in Jamaica.
He's young.
No, it's a chicken nugget, chicken strips.
Yeah.
We need
A
some
processed
diversity.
chicken man, huh?
We need some
No.
we need some diversity in this now. Oh, and I made my deposit when I paid off my portion. We're going to Sevierville
Are you?
for the
Which, when is it?
PTP,
It's in August.
22nd, but,
What month?
August.
August.
Okay. But Anthony Disney called me today, he said, we getting a place, him, his parents, and some more folks from Upward, job from very preachers. And then he's gonna follow up, share a house with them, so. We're getting more money today.
I'm going to Bearville
Yeah,
in June.
now, I didn't know this, but you know,
But
I
not
found
PTP.
out today that Greg Disney, Sunday worship at, we had Sunday morning worship at, Brunson. And where, in Branson.
In Branson.
Yeah,
Yeah, they're doing 2 PTPs
Yeah.
this year.
Mhm. I thought that was,
Okay.
You might want to do Branson.
yeah.
My wife wants to do both.
Yeah,
And I don't know how we're gonna manage that.
We'll call you driving it.
Why you say Branson, Ray?
Why did I say Branson?
Yeah,
you
why you
said
say
you
Branson?
might wanna do Branson. I said,
No,
why?
that's John might want to do Branson.
Why?
Why?
I don't know.
Cause he's John.
Why?
The one you already doing Sevierville, but you're not doing it doing PTP.
No, I'm just going up there to do some hiking.
Alright. So, you might want to go to Branson.
Cape's cold.
You might want to go to Branson PTP.
Well, I like Branson because Branson's, it's kind of like the poor man's Las Vegas. You know.
I thought that was Cherokee.
Well, it used to be Cherokee now, but so Branson has more, you know, entertainers
Yeah.
than Cherokee ever does. You
Yeah,
know,
but-
Cherokee's got the gambling.
I just thought you meant the gambling part.
No, I mean, the entertainers. The gambling part, you know, I learned early on in life that if you're gonna gamble, you're gonna have to know how to lose, and I never learned how to lose.
I mean, I'm a sore loser, so
So, I decided that gambling was not within my.
As a very,
I thought Branson was the rich country man's Las Vegas.
Okay.
as a very small
However you
child,
wanna.
we will get started in just a minute. As a very small child, my son used to ask about buying lottery tickets because there was a state lottery in Texas. And so he would ask about buying lottery tickets and I'd say, well, son, and I'd pull out a $20 bill and his eyes would get real big and say, when you can afford to take a $20 bill, set it on fire and just watch it burn and walk away with a smile on your face, we'll talk about it. And he'd look at me like, burn a $20 bill? Are you crazy?
Yeah.
And so by the time he was old enough to actually go buy a lottery ticket if he wanted to, he was, oh, I worked too hard for that money.
Yeah.
So that solved the problem for us. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. It looks like most everybody is here. I guess we've been recording all that time. I may have to edit that part out. Oh, well. Take your Bible, turn to Revelation chapter 10. And here in chapter 10, we come to a new section or another section of the book where there is call it an intermission, call it a break, call it an interlude, whatever you want. It separates the sounding of the 6th trumpet from the 7th trumpet. It's kind of like chapter 7 where we had that 30-minute space between the 6th seal and the 7th seal. There are some distinct differences. In chapter 7, what did John see? He saw visions of the saved being marked, being sealed for their own protection, sealed against the judgments that are coming on the earth, on mankind. He sees rejoicing around the throne of God. Here in chapter 10, we don't know what he sees. He's going to hear and see things that he's not allowed to tell us about. He's not allowed to reveal. Pick up at verse 1 and read down through verse 7 with me. The English Standard Version says, then I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven, wrapped in a cloud with a rainbow over his head, and his face was like the sun, and his legs like pillars of fire. He had a little scroll open in his hand. He set his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land, and called out with a loud voice like a lion roaring. When he called out, the 7 thunders sounded, and when the 7 thunders had sounded, I was about to write. But I heard a voice from heaven saying, seal up what the 7 thunders have said, and do not write it down. And the angel whom I saw standing on the sea and on the land raised his right hand to heaven and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and what is in it, the earth and what is in it, and the sea and what is in it, that there would be no more delay, but that in the days of the trumpet call to be sounded by the seventh angel, the mystery of God would be revealed, would be fulfilled, just as he announced to his servants, the prophets. Okay. John is able to understand what he hears. He interprets what he sees. He's about to write it down. Don't write it down. He's going to be told in the next paragraph in verse 10, consume this small scroll, eat this small scroll. That's a preparation for what he's about to have to do. Now, notice down there in verses 10 and 11, the scroll that we'll talk about in a minute, that's not the same scroll that we saw back in chapter 5. It's a different scroll. We mentioned chapter 7, the break between the sixth and seventh seal. Here in chapter 10, the break between the sixth trumpet and the seventh trumpet. That break is a dramatic pause, if you will. It causes the reader to sit up and pay attention. I can't tell you off the top of my head what the product being advertised was, but years ago there was a commercial that aired on television routinely, an advertisement that the tagline was, if you want to get someone's attention, whisper. And that's kind of what this is, something that causes people's attention to zero in, to focus. Think about when you sit in worship on Sunday morning and the preacher is preaching and going to town and pounding the pulpit and really excited, and then just stops, pauses, silence. Every head in the room snaps up. What? Huh? What did I miss? What's happening? That's what this is in a manner of speaking. These breaks in the action focus attention. They make you sit up and pay attention. Each series of seals, each series of vision, the seals, the trumpets, the bowls, emphasizes what? We're moving closer to the end, whatever that will be. Now, flip over for a moment to verse 7 and notice there, the sounding of the seventh trumpet is going to signal what? Completion, or the fulfillment of the mystery of God. Now, go back to Romans chapter 11, and Paul talks about the mystery of God in verses 25 through 36. Ephesians chapter 1, he talks about the mystery of God in verses 9 through 12. In 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16, he talks about the mystery of God. What is the mystery of God? At least in Paul's writing, the mystery that Paul is referring to is how God can reconcile both Jew and Gentile to himself through Christ. To the Jew, that was a befuddling mystery all through the ancient period of the national existence of Israel. They had prophets telling them, as Isaiah does in Isaiah chapter 44, for example, I will give you to be a light to the Gentiles. And what do they interpret that as? They don't really understand that. It's not until Christ comes and Paul, among the other apostles, explains this that it perfectly makes sense. Is this the same mystery that John is describing here? Go ahead, Ray.
I'll tell you one interesting side point, just to that. Rabbinical writings from the Old Testament said that they knew that there would be something.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't know what it was, but they said that they knew that the Gentiles wouldn't have really one God.
Right.
It was the same God as theirs. But beyond that, they said they didn't know what was going to happen. But they knew that at some point in time, the Gentiles will someday come to learn that they won't have one God.
Right. Right.
But what's rabbinical?
The teachers of the Jews, the scribes, the Pharisees, the rabbis,
Right.
the prominent teachers among the Jews. Well, as we go through here, this intermission that John sees and observes, there's no reference here like there was with the first one to protecting God's people. It's not focused on the safety of God's people. What do we see here? It emphasizes that loyalty to God can coexist under persecution. You can be persecuted for your faith and still be faithful to God. You can suffer and still be devoted. You can pay a price for your faith and still be faithful. And that's important for these Christians at the end of the first century. Now, go back to the beginning of chapter 10. I saw another strong angel, or another mighty angel. And that seems to distinguish this angel from any other that we've seen so far. And John describes him. He's wrapped in a cloud. There's a rainbow over his head. His face is like the sun. His legs are like pillars of fire. It's a very impressive, very distinct image. And his mission is to declare the conclusion or the end of God's mystery. And he delivers the little scroll to John. We'll get to that in a minute. But here, his appearance is similar. It's not identical, but it is similar to what we saw of Jesus back in chapter 1, chapter 4, and so forth in the Revelation. He's not one of the 7 angels with trumpets. He's a different angel, evidently. Our friends in the Watchtower cult, the Jehovah's Witnesses, say, see, this is Jesus. And they turn back to Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. This is Jesus. This is Jesus. There's a problem with that. His appearance here is similar. But notice, right off the bat, what does John say about him? How does he describe him? He calls him an angel. He doesn't call him the Lord. He has more in common with the trumpet angel in chapter 5, verse 2, than he does with Jesus in chapter 1. And if this is Jesus, let's just put it this way. If this is Jesus, it's the only passage in the Revelation where he's called an angel. And the oath that this angel takes at verse 6 does not make sense the way it's worded. Now, think about the Hebrews writer, for example, talking about God interposing with an oath with Abraham when he could swear by no one greater. By whom did he swear? By whom did God swear?
Himself.
By himself, exactly. Now, the witnesses have no problem with this because they do not believe that Jesus is God. They believe he is a little g God, a demigod or a semigod, the first created being in God's creative process. But that's not what John tells us in John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. It's interesting, in the Greek text there in John chapter 1, you get back to the text of that, and it doesn't say the Word was God. It says God was the Word. It's an emphatic way of stating it. And it does not say, the witnesses say, well, see, there's no definite article there, so that means it's a God. But grammatically, by reversing the order, God was the Word in Greek, that's an emphatic way of saying God and the Word are the same. So the Word was God, not a God. Well, here, the witnesses look at this and say, well, that's why he swears by God. Look at the oath that's mentioned here as we go along. The oath that he gives in verse 6, he swore by him who lives forever and ever. Now, if this is Jesus, who is God in the flesh, how would he swear if he were going to swear? Just like God the Father. I swear by me. There's no one greater. God the Father is not greater than the Son. God the Son is not greater than the Father. God the Spirit is not greater than Father or Son. They're all God. They're all part of God. So it would not make sense in verse 6 for him to take that kind of oath if this is Jesus, because he is deity. But here at verse 1, John says, I saw another, and the Greek word is allos, another of the same kind. It's the same word that Paul uses in Galatians chapter 1 in verses 6 through 9, where he says, I'm amazed, I marvel that you're so soon removing to another gospel, which is not another. And Paul makes a sort of play on words there. At least it's a play on words in English, because the first another is a hetero gospel, like the difference between a man and a woman. Despite what our current society says, a man cannot be a woman cannot be a man is a man, a woman is a woman. They're heterosexual, they're different sexes. But he says, I marvel that you're so soon removing to another, a hetero gospel, a fundamentally different gospel, which is not allos. It's not another of the same kind. It's not an equal competitor to the gospel that you learned. It's something fundamentally different. So John comes along here in Revelation chapter 10 and verse 1, and he says, I saw another, allos, another of the same kind, a mighty angel. So the image, the description, he's robed in a cloud, as it were. He has a rainbow over him. Well, that might take us back to Ezekiel chapter 1, 26 through 28. But the point here is that this angel is what? He's a messenger of God, a messenger for God. He is merely an angel. He's not the Son of God. Now, that rainbow, we see rainbow flags around. I mean, we've got a rainbow crosswalk up the other end of town and what have you. And in our society, in Western society in the 21st century, what does the rainbow represent to most secular, unchurched, unbiblically literate people? It represents sexual orientation. Let's just put it at that. Biblically, what does the rainbow represent?
Promise of God.
God's promise, but specifically what promise? I will never, ever, ever destroy the world by water again. Noah's flood, never going to happen again. And every time you see that rainbow in the sky and the clouds, what is that? That's a reminder. God is faithful. It's a reminder of God's faithfulness, of God's consistency, the dependability of God. How many times has the world been flooded by water since that time? Never. Now, floods have happened, but the world has never been completely flooded since that time, and it never will be completely flooded ever again because God promised. Go ahead, Brother Ray.
You know, we do have to convince people that the world has been flooded.
Yeah,
Because some people don't believe that.
that's the corollary to that evidence. A lot of people don't believe the world ever was flooded. Oh, it was a localized flood. It was big, but it didn't cover the whole world. Well, okay. Explain the Grand Mesa in Colorado. It's a volcanic plug, but it's leveled off. Explain what the Coloradoans call the Dobies at the foot of the Grand Mesa. Feet and feet and feet of water-laid clay way up high in the Rocky Mountains. Explain the Grand Canyon. Explain the separation of the continents. There's one explanation that answers all of those things, and it's not billions of years. It's a gigantic flood. Explain why we find fossils of trilobites on tops of mountains. Trilobites are sea-dwelling creatures. How'd they get to the top of the mountain? Well, I guess they grew legs and walked and then lost their legs and got fossilized. That would be the evolutionist or the non-believer's explanation, but that doesn't hold any water. You're right, though. We have to, we with some folks, we have to first cope with the idea that they don't believe in the flood before we ever get to the faithfulness of God in the rainbow. Well, the imagery here, and the point of all of this is the imagery here shows that this is an angel, not the Son of God, despite what our Watchtower friends and some other commentators will say. He's clothed with cloud. Well, what was the last image that the apostles saw of Jesus as he's ascended?
Going up into.
He's taken up in cloud. There's connection there. Now, some would say that this also portends impending judgment, and maybe so, maybe no. Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 15 might give some basis for that. But regardless, John recognizes what he sees. This is an angel. He has a little scroll, and notice at verse 2, initially the scroll is open. The scroll that we saw in chapter 5 was not. It was sealed up. But this scroll is open initially. It's in his hand. And this one immediately is closed. Now, John is about to write. No, you're not allowed to write that. One land on sea, one land on earth or land. One foot. 1 foot on the sea, 1 foot on the land. Authority over all creation, the universality of the message, perhaps. No one is exempted here. No one is excluded. There is no place of escape other than to be faithful in Christ. You look at verses 3 and 4, the angel speaks, cries out with a loud voice. John describes it like a lion roaring. Now, if you've ever been to the zoo, or if you've been on an African safari for that matter, but if you've ever been to the zoo, when the big cats are in season, and I don't want to be crude here, but when the lion roars, everything and everybody in the zoo sits up and takes notice. It's a sound that carries, and it's a sound that gets your attention. That's the point here. This angel cries out with a loud voice like a roaring lion. Whoa, everybody's going to pay attention to what he has to say. He's answered, or the response is the 7 thunders, which would seem to indicate a complete or a comprehensive response. And John understands what they say. Look at verse 4. The 7 thunders, when the 7 thunders had sounded, I was about to write, but I heard a voice from heaven saying, seal up what the 7 thunders have said. Do not write it down. Well, that would seem to imply what? John understood what the 7 thunders said. It was intelligible. It was not just boom, 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 rolling thunder. It was a message. It was something. It was a response that could be understood. They spoke articulately. What did they say? Beats me. John is not allowed to tell us. The scroll, the message is sealed up immediately. Seal up what the 7 thunders have said. Do not write it down.
So what exactly does he mean by seal up?
Seal it up?
Yes.
Yeah, it's
He's not gonna write it down.
close it up, as it were. Conceal it. It's not to be revealed, and it's locked up. Now, is John? Is that going to be the content of the little scroll that John eats? I don't know. But as we go along, this sealing or this closing up shows us God doesn't give us every detail of what we might like to know. Now, it's interesting. Bruce Metzger, in his comments on this passage in the book Breaking the Code, I'll just kind of summarize what he says is the gist of this is that there are dimensions of reality that no mortal can comprehend. There are things that God has not revealed to us that we don't need to know. What is the most insatiable desire of humanity over the span of time? When, why, how, what, who? I want to know. It's all the questions a good reporter asks: who, what, when, where, why, how? And sometimes God's answer is none of your business. You don't need to know that. That doesn't stop us wanting to know, but God does not give us every detail. And think about this. What happens when you have every detail of something? Depending on what kind of personality you have, you ever get bogged down in the details? Get lost in the weeds? Ever know an engineer who can't make a decision until he has not only got 100% of the information, but has triple checked it and then still can't be sure that he's making the right decision, or she? I've worked with some folks like that, and it's maddening. Sometimes you make your decision based on 95% of the available information, and you can't afford to wait for the other 5% to come in. Otherwise, how would you ever cross the street? The light says walk. You look this way, you look that way, you look back this way again. Everything looks safe, and you walk. What if somebody comes out of a parking lot at the last minute? Well, you better run. When that light starts blinking, it means run, don't walk. Well, that's maybe a little bit simplistic, but here, God doesn't tell us everything that we want to know. He tells us everything we need to know. And there's a huge difference between those two things. Now, for what it's worth, and you'll find this in the notes, if you find a biblical commentator that says, I can tell you what the message was, don't believe him, because he doesn't know. So we come down to the oath here in verses 5 and 6. And the angel's hand is raised to heaven, which that's it would appear to be a just like we raise your right hand in taking an oath. It would appear to be a visual appeal, a gesture. It's not possible to swear by anyone stronger than God. And the focus of the oath comes at verse 6. What's at verse 6? Well, he swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and what is in it, earth and what is in it, the sea and what is in it, that there would be no more delay. Okay, that seems to be the gist of the oath. No more delay after this. Now, it's interesting. At verses 6 and 7, the mystery of God. What is the mystery of God? Well, every other passage that speaks of the mystery of God ultimately relates it back to his plan for human salvation. Look at verse 7. What's in verse 7? The days of the trumpet call to be sounded by the seventh angel, the mystery of God will be not revealed, but finished, fulfilled. There's a distinction here, just as he announced to his servants, the prophets. What would be the conclusion, the finishing point, the termination of God's mystery to save humanity through Christ? Where does that end?
Second coming.
Second coming, the end of time. When God finally says, okay, I'm going to pull the plug, everybody out of the pool. When time is no more, go back to Matthew 25. Those two parables we talked about last time, and the picture of judgment that Jesus paints. What's the point of both the parables and the picture of judgment? it follows Matthew 24. When you see all these signs, get out of town, get out of Jerusalem. The abomination of desolation is coming. But of that day knows no one, not even the Son, but the Father only. There's no warning for that day. Therefore, parable, picture of judgment. What's the point of the parables and the picture of judgment? Really very simple. Get ready now while you can. Stay ready now while you can. And then when doesn't matter, does it? If I'm ready, what does Paul write to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4? I'm already being offered. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I've kept faith. I'm ready to go. What does he write to the Philippians, Colossians? One of those two escapes me right now. It's more needful for me to stay here, but if it was up to me, I'd rather go on and be with the Lord. I'm ready to go. I'm prepared. Are you ready to go? Prepared for the coming of the Lord, or for the conclusion of your presence here? One of our dear brothers at Fayetteville passed last week. His funeral was Sunday afternoon in Tennessee. He was ready. I got word this morning that one of our aged sisters passed unexpectedly. She's 97, but she's been in good health, and mine was just sharp as a tack. But she passed this morning. Are you ready? Are you ready? Now, you think about the mystery of God, and go back to Mark chapter 4 and verse 11. And what does Jesus say there? He said to them, to you it has been given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God. But to those who are outside, all things come in parables. Jesus is explaining to his disciples, here's why I speak to you in plain language, and why I speak to the multitudes in parables. What does the parable do?
Well, it breaks down the principles that God's trying to teach in terms that people, common people can't understand.
Well, not only it breaks it down in terms that we can relate to, but it also challenges the hearer. It separates those with ears to hear from those who aren't willing to hear, who don't get the point of it. Those who are looking and those who are not. Go to 1 Corinthians 2 and verse 7, and Paul says, we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the ages for our glory. In old times, in Old Testament, the Old Testament era, even the wisest among the Jews didn't understand how God was going to accomplish this. What did they understand about the sacrifices that they offered and so forth? They got, at least on some level, that the blood of bulls and goats is not comparable to the blood of man. You slaughter a bull, your life is not forfeit in exchange for that bull. You can slaughter that bull and offer it as a sacrifice. You can slaughter that bull and eat it. Make a coat out of its hide or whatnot. The loss of that animal's life is not comparable to the loss of a man's life. And yet, what did they offer for their sins? The blood of bulls and goats, the lives of bulls and goats. Well, they understood that. They understood that that was connected in some way to God justifying them, but they didn't know exactly how. What does Peter tell us about the Old Testament prophets? They sought and searched diligently what time or manner of times that these things would be, but they didn't understand. God had not revealed it to them. But go over to Ephesians chapter 3, and in verse 9, part of Paul's privilege is to make all see what is the fellowship of the mystery, which from the beginning of the ages has been hidden in God, who created all things through Jesus Christ. By the way, he who created all things through Jesus Christ, Ephesians 3 and verse 9, go out in the margin of your Bible there and go, just put a little cross-reference, John chapter 1 and verse 1. Paul is saying the same thing that John said. Jesus was the active agent in creation. Flip over to Colossians chapter 1 and verse 27. And there, Paul writes, to them God willed to make known what are the riches of the glory of this mystery among the Gentiles, which is what? Christ in you, the hope of glory. In chapter 2 of Colossians, in verse 2, their hearts may be encouraged, being knit together in love, attaining to all riches of the full assurance of understanding, to the knowledge of the mystery of God, both of the Father and of Christ. Skip down to chapter 4, and in verse 3, meanwhile praying also for us that God would open for us, or to us, a door for the word to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in chains. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, and verse 16, without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. What's the mystery? God was manifested in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen by angels, preached among the Gentiles, believed on in the world, and received up in glory. So the mystery's already been revealed, but now it's going to be fulfilled. It's going to be completed. And the focus is that there is a distinct point when God's patience, God's waiting, God's delay will come to its conclusion. It's not that God will run out of patience, it's that God has set a time. What did Paul tell the Athenian philosophers in Acts chapter 17, verses 30 and 31? God has appointed a time in which he'll do what? Judge the world. Judge all. How? By the man whom he has chosen, that is, by Jesus Christ. So that brings us then to the seventh trumpet there in verse 7. And its position, the seventh trumpet, the final trumpet, that may be suggestive of, or a precursor, if you will, of the trumpet sound at the conclusion of time. You know, what does Paul tell the Thessalonian Christians in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 7, 8, 9? To you who are afflicted, rest with us till the Lord is revealed from heaven in flaming fire. But before he gets to that, go back to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And what does he say there? The Lord will descend from heaven with what? With a shout, the voice of the archangel, and what? The trump of God, the trumpet of God, the trumpet sound, as it were. But here, this trumpet signals the fulfillment of God's mystery, the conclusion, the end. What's a mystery?
Something not revealed.
Something that has been concealed. But you go back and read your Hardy Boys mystery, or your Nancy Drew, or if you're an adult, you read John le Carré or Maigret or something like that. At the end of the story, is it still a mystery story? To anybody that hasn't read it. But now you know how it works out, don't you? You know the mystery. Well, here, the mystery has been concealed. It doesn't necessarily remain so. Now it's going to be not only fulfilled, not only revealed, but fulfilled. It's going to come to its conclusion. You ever read a mystery and halfway through, 2/3 of the way through, 3/4, you're thinking, I think I know how this is going to end. I think I see how it's going to end. And then you get to the end and it's different. They throw you a little twist. Yeah. Go ahead, John.
Mystery also could mean something that is not understood.
Yeah.
Been revealed, but you still don't understand.
That's
And
possible.
That's how I take it.
That's possible.
The mystery has been revealed, but there's people that still
Well, the world's full of people that don't understand
don't
it.
understand it. So to them, it's a mystery.
They haven't read the book yet, have they?
Well, they may have read the
Some
book.
of them have and
They have read
didn't
the
get
book,
it.
but they didn't
Yeah.
read the book.
Some of them have read the book and didn't get it.
Yeah.
Most of the world has never read the book. So that's the starting point there. But now look at verses 8 through 11. And let's talk about this little book that John is going to have to consume. So You pick up at verse 8, then the voice that I heard from heaven spoke to me again, saying, go take the scroll that is open in the hand of the angel who is standing on the sea and on the land. I went to the angel and told him to give me the little scroll, and he said to me, take and eat it. It will make your stomach bitter, but in your mouth it will be sweet as honey. And I took the little scroll from the hand of the angel and ate it. It was sweet as honey in my mouth, but when I had eaten it, my stomach was made bitter. And I was told, you must again prophesy about many peoples and nations and languages and kings. So it gave him a bellyache. It was not palatable in that way. The message is sweet. Anything from God in its proper context is sweet. Your word is a lamp unto my feet, a light unto my path. Through thy precepts I get understanding, therefore I hate every false way. You look back to Psalm 119, verse 103, and the word is sweet. Ira North describes this as good news because it portrays God as what? He's ready to act. What John is seeing seemingly is, okay, this is the end of things. God is ready to pull it all together and be done with it. His delay, his patience, his waiting is coming to an end. Go back to the saints under the throne or under the altar. What are they saying? How long? How long? And now John is saying, okay, you're not going to have to wait anymore at this point. Well, the message is sweet because it comes from God. But if you're not ready for God, for the Lord to come, it's bitter. Because what's going to happen to you if you're not prepared? You're going to be caught off guard. You're going to be too late to prepare. God has warned and sent judgments and maybe even allowed persecution to be unleashed. You look at chapter 11, we'll get to that. Bad news in a manner of speaking. If you're not ready, all that's going to catch up with you. But look at the message that follows at verse 11. John, you're not done yet. John, you're not finished. You've still got a bunch of people to talk to pass this on to. A renewal of his commission to prophesy. There's more to come. It might seem like this is just about finished and John can sigh of relief. I'm about finished. Nope, not yet. You're seeing the end. God is showing you the end, but the end has not yet arrived. So the first scroll or the first book with its 7 seals and its 7 trumpets, they're almost finished. There's 1 trumpet left. Chapter 11, verse 15. So we come to chapter 11. Now, Stafford North suggests that the contents of the little book are what we're going to see in chapter 12. We'll talk about that perhaps when we get there. But flip over to chapter 11 now, and let's progress on. If you have comments, if you have questions, feel free to speak up. Now, a little background as we start into chapter 11. I was given a measuring rod, a staff told, rise, measure the temple of God. Little background. The preterist interpretation of Revelation and all prophecy for that matter is going to stand or fall on dating this book, Revelation, to the mid-60s and the reign of Nero. Because when is the temple destroyed? 70 AD, when Jerusalem is demolished. So the preterist position that basically says that every prophecy has been fulfilled already and all of this was leading up to the destruction of the temple. Preterism stands or falls on 70 AD and the destruction of the temple. And within our brotherhood, that perspective opens the door to Max King's AD 70 doctrine of realized eschatology, which is a little narrow variety of preterism. It's ironic then that even a number of well-known commentators among our brethren, Burton Kaufman among them, who was an advocate of an early date for the book of Revelation, for a pre-70 date, they agree, nevertheless, not with the preterists, but with Westcott and Hort and others in the higher critical school of thought when it comes to the temple. When John is told, measure the temple, they see that, as the higher critics did, not as the physical temple in Jerusalem, but as a figure for the church. And that reference to the place where Jesus was crucified, not necessarily as the literal location of Golgotha, but a description of basically human rebellion, Jewish rebellion particularly, against the will of God, not the city of Jerusalem itself. Now, the images that we see in chapter 11 continue from chapter 10. There's really no break. After he's told you're going to continue, you've got more to say, you've got to prophesy to peoples and nations and languages and kings, then John, seemingly pretty well immediately, is given a measuring rod. This is not a new series of visions. This is still part of that break between the 6th and 7th trumpet. So I'm given a staff. I was told, rise, measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there, but do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it's given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant authority to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. So this is a continuation of that interlude in chapter 10. Just as there was a pause before the 7th seal, now this is part of the pause before the 7th trumpet. Some commentators say, well, this is what's in the scroll. North, as I said, says, no, that is put off at least until chapter 12, if the Lord reveals that at all. Regardless, whatever the contents of the scroll that John consumed, he received a revelation from God. There's joy in that. The content of it is not necessarily joyful. The message is not necessarily joyful. Think about Ezekiel in captivity in Babylon. What is Ezekiel's job for the first half of the book of Ezekiel? He's God's prophet among the captives. He speaks for God. But what's the message? You're going to be here. God, you're here because of your sin. You're not going home early. Your false prophets that are telling you this is only going to last a couple of years, that's exactly what they are. They're false prophets. They're lying. That's not going to happen. God is punishing you because of your sin. Get over it. Get used to it. Settle down, buy a farm, build a house, get married, have kids, have grandkids. You're going to be here because of your sin. Ezekiel is God's man. What a privilege, what an honor, what a thrill to have God speak directly to and through you. And yet, what's the message that God gives him? Tell those stiff-necked, idol-worshiping elders, I'm not going to let them go home. They're not going to see Jerusalem again. They're going to die out here, and their grandkids can see Jerusalem. It's not a happy message. And then when Jerusalem is finally destroyed in 586, those same elders that have argued and disputed and fought with him turn around and say, well, maybe our God doesn't even really exist at all. Maybe these Babylonians are right. And Ezekiel has to start all over with them saying, no, your God does exist. This is exactly what it told you was going to happen. Now, don't give up on him now. He's still going to restore you. He still loves you. He still cares about you. You're just paying the price for your sins. So it's sweet and it's bitter. What a privilege to be God's spokesman. What a bummer to have to say some of the things that you have to say. Here's the job of a gospel preacher. When Paul writes to Timothy and says, be urgent, in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort. Oh my goodness. I love the way Marshall Keeble used to describe that. He says, preach it when they like it and preach it when they don't. Some of the things, if you're going to preach the whole counsel of God, some of the things you have to teach and preach are things you don't like to talk about, don't want to have to talk about, wish that you didn't need to talk about. But it's part of the whole counsel of God. So, you charge into chapter 11, and what are we introduced to? Woes and hardships, misery, those who've rejected the goodness of God, the grace of heaven, are going to turn against those who have accepted the goodness of God, impose on them hardship. The enemies of the cross are going to rise up against the saved. Those who stand opposed to the immorality, the evil that is present in the Roman culture, the Roman Empire. Let's pause for just a second. I know our time is quickly passing, but pause for just a second and think. Is an empire or a kingdom where one person rules, is that an inherently bad, evil environment? No, because Christ is king over his kingdom, is he not? In truth, the absolute best government for humans is not a democracy or a republic or a constitutional monarchy or anything of the sort. It is a dictatorship, but a benevolent dictatorship. In other words, it's to have a king like Jesus, who cares more for his people than he does for himself. But no ordinary human measures up to that. So here, the Roman Empire, the fact that it's an empire, the fact that there's an emperor, that's not what makes it evil. What makes it evil is the influence of evil in the empire and on the emperor. You've got Domitian, and Trajan's going to follow him, and they're going to persecute Christians for what? For not worshiping Julius Caesar, for not worshiping Caesar Augustus, for not worshiping the putative gods of Rome. Here, the woes, at least for the Christians that first read this, they would interpret this as woes being directed against Rome for persecuting, opposing, tormenting the saints. Now, in a larger picture, what would we see? Rome is long gone, buried and gone.
Woes against anyone who persecutes.
Exactly. We go from the immediate circumstance to the basic principle. Here's, by the way, where our friends in the millennialist and the dispensational movement get off track. They keep trying to make a specific, concrete, situational application of basic principles. They try to take it all and make it apply to the United States and Russia, or the United States, the Muslim world. It's always the United States and Western Europe against the world. Well, that's not what's in view here, but rather the principle of righteousness, godliness versus sin in the world. So, measure the temple. Well, that's significant on a variety of levels. If this is being written in the 90s, as I believe it is, where's the temple? Temple's been gone for 25 years. It was destroyed by the Romans 25 years, 26 years ago. Where is John culturally and in history? John is a Christian, but he's a Jewish Christian, seemingly living in the Gentile world now at this point, probably in or around Ephesus, historians tell us. But when John is told, measure the temple, what image would naturally come to mind for him, and probably for every Jewish Christian over the age of about 40 at this point? What would the temple in Jerusalem, Herod's temple, the second temple that Herod had enlarged, that would be their mental visual frame of reference, but that's gone.
That's why I said it can't be talking about that per se.
Exactly. It can't be talking about that physical temple.
Hey, Dave, you got a comment in the chat room.
Okay. For those of you online, let me reiterate if you have a comment, speak up, because when you make a comment in chat, it just puts a tiny little blip at the bottom of the screen, and I don't see it because I'm not looking directly at it. It says, wouldn't a non-Christian need both a preacher, Christian man or woman, and the Spirit received at baptism in order to discern the scriptures? A little bit off track here, but if you have the scriptures, you have the product of the Spirit, do you not? Who inspired the inspired writers? It was the Holy Spirit. Do I need the Spirit then to illuminate in some way what He's given me to understand? It's helpful to have a Christian to guide me, to direct me. Is it absolutely essential? Why did God give us the Word if we cannot understand it?
Yeah, I don't think God relies on man to help man understand what God has given us. He may use man to help,
There's the
but
distinction.
he doesn't rely on man.
There's the distinction. God uses man, but it is not essential to have someone guide you. Now, the Ethiopian in Acts chapter 8, Philip, how can I understand this unless someone guides me? But number one, what is he reading? He's reading Isaiah 53. Number two, what was the traditional rabbinic or Talmudic understanding of Isaiah, which is what he would have known, if anything, and that is, well, Isaiah must have been talking about himself. But number three, why didn't he just turn in the New Testament? Because it hadn't been written down yet. So yes, he needed someone to guide him because he didn't have a New Testament to explain it. We have the New Testament that we can read and
He
understand.
also had plenty of people that were telling him what it meant.
He had
but
Philip
he
explain
I
it.
think he was saying, look, I hear all what they're saying, but I don't think this is what it means. Somebody needs to help me understand.
Well, that's entirely possible too, given that he had been to Jerusalem. He might have been exposed to someone proclaiming the gospel and not
Well, I mean,
understood it
yeah,
at that point.
Not proclaiming the gospel, but
Or he may have been misdirected by it.
he said, but there's gotta be more to it. So
Very possibly. Go ahead,
Also,
Ray.
the New Testament talks about in Ephesians that God did lead people who had gifts per se.
Yeah, through those early generations of the church, you had people with inspired abilities.
Yeah, and also 1 Corinthians 12
Mhm.
talks about those inspired gifts.
Yeah, 12, 13, and 14, use them properly.
Right. So you did have some people that could explain what was going on, but I think you're absolutely right. You have the Word of God that is understandable and you can read it.
Well, that is exactly what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13. We think about that, the love chapter of the Bible, and it does talk about love, but that's the thing that's more excellent than all those spiritual gifts. And you look at verses 9 and 10, and what does Paul say? When I was a child, I thought as a child, I spoke as a child, but then when I grew up, I put away childish things. Now, I know in part, I prophesy in part, then, that is, when the word is completed, I shall know fully, even as I am known. In other words, God will have revealed everything that we need to know.
And then
We
also-
have everything that we need to know.
Then also you have Hebrews, which talks about knowing the fundamentals and moving on to meat. So,
Yeah. Hebrews end of chapter 5 into chapter 6, progress from spiritual immaturity to spiritual maturity. Well, as we talk about that temple, it had been destroyed in 70 AD, most of the city of Jerusalem, you have a contrast here. a contrast between the temple and the city, the outer court. And that contrast emphasizes a distinction. What is John told? Leave out the court outside the temple. It's given over to the nations. Now, about the date of the revelation, Eusebius, who was a historian who lived only 200 years after Domitian. So he's living at the end of the third into the fourth centuries, 200s into 300s. Eusebius gathered evidence about the book of Revelation, both from Christian sources and from secular sources that were still available at that time. And all of the sources that Eusebius had at his disposal. Now, keep in mind, he is 1700 years closer to John than we are. All of the resources that he had available place the date of John being exiled on the island of Patmos during the reign of Domitian. And his earliest source is Irenaeus, who was a disciple of Polycarp, a student, someone taught by a fellow named Polycarp, who in turn was taught by John. Why does that matter? Because we know when Polycarp was born. Polycarp dates John's exile during Domitian's reign, 81 to 96 AD. Polycarp was born in 65 AD, which means that he was 5 years old when Jerusalem was destroyed, when the temple was destroyed. He could not have been taught by John to be a Christian until he was at least a few years older. Well, which one of us would baptize into Christ a 5-year-old? There is no biblical precedent for that. Let's, for argument's sake, say that Polycarp was 13 when he became a Christian. Just arbitrary number for argument's sake. Old enough that he could conceivably have understood and obeyed the gospel. That's still 8 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. There is zero evidence from the first 3 centuries of the church's existence of anyone who believed that John wrote the Revelation during Nero's time in the 60s. So the instruction, measure the sanctuary, and that's really the word here, not temple, but the sanctuary, the holy place, that parallels what Ezekiel was told in Ezekiel chapter 45. And the temple that Ezekiel saw was not Solomon's temple, and it was not Zerubbabel's temple, because Ezekiel gives the dimensions of it, and the dimensions that Ezekiel gives don't match Solomon's temple, they don't match Zerubbabel's temple, and historically they don't match the enlargement of Zerubbabel's temple by Herod. So we have a figurative temple in Ezekiel, a symbol. Why is it such a stretch for this to be a figure or a symbol in the Revelation? It's not a proof. This reference, measure the sanctuary, this is not a proof that the temple was still standing. Now, the idea, hold on just a second, John, the idea that John wrote during Nero's era didn't come up until the 1700s. From the late 1700s until about halfway through the 1900s. That was prominent. That was in the higher critical, or a reaction to the higher critical school of thought, the skeptical school of thought. What you see in that, and over time you see it kind of flowing back the other way, you see the ebb and flow of scholarly opinion, not statements of fact. Go ahead, John.
It's just when the completion of one and them that worship therein.
Yep.
Is he gonna measure the people, he was given a rod, we got that.
Yep.
Measure the temple and them that worship therein. That to me is kind of like throws up, I won't say a red flag, but throws up something like, well, how is he measuring? He's got a rod,
Yeah, he's got a measuring stick, got a yardstick.
yardstick, whatever else, but how is he measuring those that worship within?
Well, what
Whether
is,
they're 5 foot tall or?
what is a yardstick? What is a measuring rod? What does it represent?
It's a standard.
Exactly.
Right,
So see if they measure up to
yeah.
the standard. It's not, are you 5 feet tall, 6 feet tall, 7 feet tall, 3 feet tall? It's, do you measure up to God's standard or not? Notice the distinction. Measure those who are inside the temple. Don't measure those outside.
Mhm.
That court outside is left to the nations, and they're going to trample. They're in opposition, obvious opposition. So the image here stands in contrast to the city and the outer court.
And the outer court
What's
was for Gentiles, wasn't it?
what's the temple? Go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9, 10, and 11. Neither fornicators, adulterers, et cetera, will inherit the kingdom of God. And such were some of you, but you were washed, sanctified, justified, and so forth. Come down to the end of the chapter. And what does Paul say in verses 19 and 20 in 1 Corinthians chapter 6? To Christians, don't you know that you are what? The temple of God. And the Spirit of God dwells in you. You are the temple. Well, flip over to Galatians chapter 6 and verse 16. Who is the church in Galatians 6 and verse 16? How are they described? How are we described?
Living stones.
That's Peter. 1 Peter 2, we're living stones built into a holy structure for God. But in Galatians 6, we're the Israel of God.
Go back.
Measure the temple here.
Before the Galatians, what was that again?
1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11, and then 19 and 20. The temple. Measure the temple and the altar and those who worship there. Don't measure those who are outside. Don't measure the outside of it. Now, come through here and you have protection, preservation for those who are saved. The rest are outside. They're left unprotected. What did we see back in the opening of the seals? And we get to the 6th to 7th seal. What transpires between seal number 6 and seal number 7? Oh, wait a minute. Let's seal the saved for their protection. Well, here now, you're going to measure those who are among the saved, distinct from those who are not. Now, come down to verse 4. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands. In verse 3, I'll grant authority to my 2 witnesses. They'll prophesy for 1260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees, the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. If anyone would harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. If anyone would harm them, this is how he is doomed to be killed, and so on and so forth. Who are these 2 witnesses?
The 2 olive trees.
Well, they're
candlesticks.
2 olive trees and 2 candlesticks, and that's as much as we know about their identity. What's significant about the number 2? What does it represent? 2 are better than
Oh,
1,
yeah,
and a
no,
3/4
no,
gold is
you
not.
need 2 witnesses to confirm.
Okay,
Yeah.
at least 2 witnesses to confirm something. 2 is better than 1, and a 3-fold cord is not soon broken. 2 represents strength, reinforcement,
Mhm.
confidence. In the Oriental mind, it represents better than 1. So these 2 witnesses, that takes the Jewish Christian at least back to the law of Moses and to Deuteronomy 19 verse 15. what Jesus mentioned in Matthew 18. At the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, all things shall be established and so forth. Now, what are we going to see? These 2 witnesses will eventually be killed. But why are they killed? For their testimony, for their faithfulness in speaking God's word. And I just realized it's 7:15. I pushed past our break time.
You just realized?
So let's stop here, take about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and talk some more about these 2 witnesses and go on through the balance of chapter 11. Comments, questions, thoughts before we break? Okay, we'll pause for about 10 minutes. Start it again. All right. In chapter 11, talking about these 2 witnesses, 2 olive trees, 2 lampstands or candlesticks that stand before the Lord. John's instructed to measure the sanctuary, the naos. That's in the Old Testament, before the temple was constructed, in the tabernacle, that was the actual tent, the structure that was the holy place and the most holy. And so it was the building at the center of the temple. In the physical temple, what do you have? You have an area where only priests are permitted to enter, and only the high priest can go into the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was. Now, if this is talking about the literal physical temple in Jerusalem, that image is necessarily going to exclude all Gentiles, even Gentile Christians, because they're not allowed in that part of the temple. So it doesn't make sense that this would be the physical temple. On the other hand, if we're talking about a spiritual temple, and that certainly accords with the analogy in Ezekiel, and Ezekiel measuring the temple, then every Christian is a priest. And so all the Christians are able to be present in the temple and to draw near to God. And the terminology here, the way this is worded, we have a very sharp contrast in thought between where God is, where God dwells, where his presence is, and the entire temple complex. You have the inner area. This is where God is, in a manner of speaking. But the courtyard outside, that does not represent the same thing. And John uses the Greek word naos, which is the sanctuary area, not the hieron, which is the whole Temple Mount. He's not talking about the entire area, but just this one spot where the priests could go. And so measure the temple, measure those who are worshiping there. Why? Well, they're being singled out, separated, recognized, distinct from the rest of the world. Protection, preservation for God's people. Everybody outside is omitted. John is not measuring the courtyard outside, not measuring the world. That's given over to the nations. There's a conflict between church and state in that setting. Question: is there a conflict between church and state now?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because, especially in most of the world outside of Western society, what is the attitude of the state toward the loyalty and the submission and the obedience of the citizens and people in their various countries? You get into an atheistic or a communistic country, for instance, or into some of the other non-democratic type, Western type government countries, and the attitude of the government is, we own you. The people are subject to the government, not the government being subject to the people. That makes this a hard concept for Western European and North American Christians to wrap our heads around a little bit, that there could be tension, conflict between church and state, where the state actually thinks that it trumps the church. But go back 1,600 years from now to the time immediately after Constantine. Constantine legitimizes the church, which is the proto-Catholic denomination, basically. What happens in the wake of that being legitimized and becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire? Well, the Roman Empire is on the decline. What would become the Catholic Church is on the rise and gaining power and influence, especially after it becomes legitimized, legalized. But by the 600s, you've got the Pope in Rome starting to gain power, starting to assert himself, and churches in the eastern part of the world pulling away. And you have the divide that leads to Roman Catholicism in Europe and the so-called Holy Roman Empire. But over here in the East, you have the rise of what's called the Orthodox Church, and all of those congregations in Greece and Hungary and Romania and all of those places that would become Eastern European nations, Russia and so forth. In that part of the world, the church doesn't dominate the state. The state dominates the church. Now, granted, we're talking about denominations in that setting, but the state trumps religious leadership there, where in Western Europe, religious leadership controls the state. In the world today, most people in our world, we have what, 8 billion people in the world, roughly speaking. About 6.5 billion of those people live in countries and under governments where at least the official perspective is government, human government, secular government is the absolute highest authority in the universe. And the church has to toe the line. Only in Western society do we have any nations and cultures where the perspective of at least some of those nations is church trumps state. And even then, what do we have going on? We have a constant pull and tension in Western society to remove church and religion and morality and moral values from having any influence in the political realm. So we come back here to the Roman time. Well, what's the Roman Empire's take on things? Rome rules all. Rome is the ultimate authority. And yet John is telling these Christians, no, they're not. God is. Go ahead, Ray.
When you said, when you was talking about your analysis of world governments and the church, you know, because when you say church to me, I'm thinking about
the Lord's church.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
And sometimes I think you're talking about
Yes.
in just religion.
Religion generally.
Yeah.
Yes. Church and state in that setting is a generic term, like constitutional scholars and so forth would talk about it. Not we as Christians, New Testament Christians would describe it.
Yeah.
It's accommodative language, but
yeah, just like you write about the things that were going on in Europe, and then you remember King Henry and his dispute. He said, "I can't deal with the church. I just create my own."
Exactly. Henry VIII, he of the many wives. Henry VIII was interesting. Wasting time here. Henry VIII. It's interesting to notice in his young years was a fierce opponent of Reformation theology. Martin Luther and John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli and so forth. And he wrote actually fairly scholarly defenses of Catholic orthodoxy, Roman Catholic orthodoxy, until he decided that he needed to get rid of Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn. And then suddenly, when the Pope would not annul his marriage, show me annulment in the Bible, by the way. When the Pope would not annul his marriage, then he broke from Roman Catholicism and set up the Anglican or the Episcopal Church with the Archbishop of Canterbury in the place of the Pope, but the king as the head of the church. Well, here, going back to the imagery that John is seeing here, the temple, what John is focused on, what the Spirit shows him here is the naos, the actual centerpiece of the temple complex, not the whole temple. And the measuring of this makes the distinction between those who are faithful to God and those who are not faithful to God, those who are serving God and those who are opposing God. The outer section that just highlights the conflict that exists between the church and the world. Now, depending on which commentaries you read, you'll find commentators that say, oh, this represents that the outer court, the city, that's the church in the Dark Ages. This was actually a common interpretation among early Protestant scholars and commentators in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. They tried to make all of the bad that they found in the book of Revelation represent the Roman Catholic denomination. And that's understandable given that this was the time period where Catholic dominance of Western Europe and Central and South America was on the wane. It was the era of the Enlightenment, the era of the Renaissance, and there was a lot of pushback against Catholicism and the Inquisition and so forth. So a lot of Protestant commentators would try to take all of these images of those in opposition to God, and rather than applying them to Rome, as probably the first century Christians would, they tried to make the connection to the Roman Catholic denomination. Is there an application that could be made? Hey, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Someone who stands opposed to the word of God is an opponent of God. But is this specifically prophetic of Roman Catholicism? It's tough to make that case. Now, go back to the end of verse 3, 1,260 days. That works out to 3.5 years, 42 months. Well, what is the significance of that number? It's half of perfect. It's half of 7. It's an unstable time period. It corresponds to Daniel 12 and verse 4, time and times and half a time. The Jewish Christians would associate that with oppression, with the suffering of Antiochus under Antiochus in the days of the Maccabees. That took about 3.5 years. John's words would what John is writing here, they would immediately recognize as, oh, this is a time of suffering. This is a time of hardship. But what else? What's God doing during this time of hardship? Those who are in the temple are protected. They're safe. So you pick up at verse 3 and go down to verse 14, which is most of the chapter here. The 2 olive trees, 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord, if anyone would harm them, and so forth. No identifying characteristics are given other than these descriptions. And how does God describe them? They're my 2 witnesses, my witnesses. Now, who are the witnesses? You can find almost as many proposals for their identity as you can find scholars and commentators willing to comment. Some would say, well, you've got the Old and the New Testaments. Some would say, well, law and the prophets. You know, Jesus talks about the law and the prophets, but Jesus also talks about the law, the prophets, and the writings, which would incorporate Job and Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. The only information, the only hint that John gives us is there in verse 2 and in verse 6. Well, what would the olive trees maybe suggest? Go back to Zechariah chapter 4, and in verses 1 through 14, the olive trees might correspond to Joshua and Zerubbabel in that context. The candlesticks, the lampstands in most modern translations. What's the purpose of a candlestick, a lampstand? What was the purpose of the lampstand in the temple?
Bring light
to light up the holy place. So
because there's no light.
frankly, so that the priests could see what they were doing. A continuous light, a source of light. The gospel in that respect, perhaps. Go ahead, Ray.
Any thought about the olive trees in Roman, the cultural olive tree versus the wild? Well, no, so that's one tree, really.
You mean the domesticated versus the wild olive?
Right.
They're related, but the difference is
Yeah.
cultivation primarily.
So let me pull that back over. Make it
Okay.
simple when I think about it.
Okay. Well, get down to verse 6 and notice here, he says, if anyone would harm them, they're doomed to be killed because they can breathe fire, so to speak. At verse 6, they have the power to shut the sky that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying, and they have power over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth and with every kind of plague as often as they desire. Well, let's think about that. Go back into the Old Testament. Who would you associate with turning off the rain? Shut the sky. Well, that's Elijah. And who can turn water into blood and so forth? Well, that takes us back to Moses. Who appears with the Lord on the Mount of Transfiguration in Matthew chapter 17? Oh, Lord, it's good for us to be here with you. Let's make 3 booths, 3 tabernacles, one for you and one for Moses, one for Elijah. This is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. Well, there are obvious connections here, so it would seem. But what would the significance of this be? They have power to shut this and to send plagues as often as they desire. Well, what's John writing at this moment in time? Peter's dead. Paul's dead. As far as we know, all the other apostles are dead. James, the Lord's brother, is probably dead at this point as well. All of Paul's books have been written. Peter's, James, Hebrews has been written. The gospel records have been written. John has written the gospel record of John and 1st and 2nd and 3rd John. What's left? This very book that he's writing. Well, what's going on until this book is finished? I know in part, I prophesy in part, when that which is perfect is come, that which is in part shall be done away. 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 10. Miraculous abilities, spiritual gifts are still present among the saints until John finishes this. Now, do they have ability to shut off the rain and turn things into blood and so forth? Not that we can see, not that we have any record of. Those things are not listed among spiritual gifts. But some commentators associate these ideas with the presence of spiritual gifts in the world still in that moment.
But 1 Corinthians 13 says what will be left was faith, hope, and love.
Faith, hope, and love. Once all that's done, then we're left with faith, hope, and love.
Is that continuing today?
The gospel's still here. The gospel of hope tells us we need faith. We ought to love one another.
But that's not a gift per se.
No. Not per se, not in the same sense that spiritual gifts were. Now, let's back up for a second. Verses 1 and 2, if we're talking about a literal physical temple, then these 2 witnesses would have to be literal physical witnesses. And yet, how are they described? They're olive trees, they're lampstands, they're figures. What 2 Christians would measure up to that? Fire proceeds out of their mouth. Think about this. Fire proceeds out of their mouth and consumes their foes. What does Jeremiah say? Is not my word like a fire? Like a hammer that breaks the rock in pieces? Some commentators would look at this and say this is a reference to the gospel that is able to purify. And what does Paul tell Christians to do? Put to death the old man of sin. That could fit. Go back into the early success of the church. What happened early on in Acts 2 and 3 and 4 and 5? Man, the church just exploded. grew like wildfire among the Jews. And then once the Jews started to really push back, what happened then? Antioch sends out Paul and Barnabas into the Gentile world. And then the growth rate just is exponential after that among the Gentiles. So we go along here, we come to this imagery, and at verse 7, when they have finished their testimony, the beast that rises from the bottomless pit, the abyss, will make war on them and conquer them and kill them, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of that great city that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. For 3.5 days, some of the peoples and tribes and languages and nations will gaze at their dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and make merry and exchange presents, because those two prophets had been a torment to those who dwell on the earth. But after 3.5 days, a breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying, "Come up here." And they went up into heaven in a cloud, and their enemies watched them. At that hour, there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. If we take any of this literally, we have to take all of it literally. Jump over to chapter 13, chapter 17, and the beast that we see here in verse 7 seems to be described in more detail there. And his opposition is described as warfare against the Lord. What's significant about Sodom and Egypt and the city or the place where the Lord was crucified? What do those three things have in common? Sodom represents
There's
what?
cities.
What do we think of when we think of Sodom?
Sin.
Sin, perversity, uncleanness.
A destroyed place.
The as Paul would say, the natural use being changed, being twisted. What about Egypt? What was in Egypt? You've got the children of Israel there, but what's their role there? Slaves. God says, "Let my people go." And how does Pharaoh respond? No, not going to do it. Plague, 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 10 plagues. Get out of my country. And then as they're getting out of my country, what does he do? Sends the army after them to drag them back. And God delivers them at the Red Sea. What about the place where the Lord was crucified? Well, where's that? That's Jerusalem, Golgotha, Calvary, whatever you want to call it, whichever place of the skull, whatever term you want to put on it. What does that represent? 3 days, Satan is, yay! And then what happened? Up from the grave he arose. What was Israel doing? What was the leadership of Israel doing in crucifying him? It's expedient for one man to die for the people, said the high priest. Better for him to die than for us to lose our hold on the nation. Rebellion. In all three cases, you have rebellion against the will of God. That seems to be the thing that ties these together, these three cities. Opposition, rebellion to God. We're talking about not locations. Here's where our dispensational friends get out of kilter again, because they try to tie this to physical geographic locations. And it's not the location, it's the condition, it's the attitude toward God that stands out here, rebellion against him. And so the bodies of these witnesses are allowed to lie unburied. Now, go back to the days of Elijah and Ahab and Jezebel. And after Ahab is out of the way, what happens to Jezebel? She sends word to Elijah, "I'm going to make you just like him." And what becomes of Jezebel?
Besides dogs eating.
She dies. And the new king in the evening said, "Oh, she's a queen. Go take her and give her a decent burial." There's nothing left to bury. She's eaten by dogs. That's an act of contempt to leave the body out there in the open. But here, that time of disrespect is just, it's limited. God will not tolerate that for long. And what happens? The witnesses are resurrected. They stand up. The rejoicing and the merrymaking, that's short-lived, short-lived. It's interesting. Christians at this point are being persecuted for what? For believing, for being Christians. And what's the point of their persecution? Who's doing the persecuting, and why are they persecuting them for their belief?
Because they don't like.
Who's doing the persecuting?
At that time.
Yeah. Roman authorities. And
because
what's
you're
the
not worshiping?
exactly?
Caesar.
Because I am not number one. I will not play second fiddle to your God. Well, you're not my God. If you won't do what I demand, I'm going to punish you. If you won't do what I demand, I'm going to kill you. I'm not going to do what you demand. Kill him. And people rejoice. You got what you had coming. Well, the Germans have a word for that. Schadenfreude. Rejoicing at someone else's misfortune, someone else's suffering. There are people in this world that seem to thrive on chaos and dissension, and they don't get any real benefit from it, but they take pleasure in confusion and uncertainty. Well, here's where the Romans seem to be. They're persecuting the church. If we can't rule, we're going to ruin. Now, in verses 9 and 10, the scene draws back, the camera draws back, and it includes not just Jerusalem, but the whole world, the whole perspective. And the gift giving here, that's in a negative way, not in a positive way. It may correspond to the act of Purim, the Jewish celebration of Purim, where in the downfall of Haman, how did the Jews celebrate? By exchanging gifts. To this day, observant Jews still celebrate Purim, which is a celebration of Haman's downfall. And at verse 10, the world's opinion it's like Ahab's opinion toward Elijah. When Ahab met Elijah at the end of the drought, what was his first statement? Ahab was encountered first by Obadiah, or Elijah was encountered first by Obadiah, who was Ahab's servant. Obadiah was a good, faithful man, apparently in secret from Ahab. And Elijah says, go tell your master I'll be here at this time. And what's Obadiah's response? You want to kill me? I've been searching for you. He's been looking, he's been trying to hunt you down. And now if I go tell him you're here, he'll come and you'll be gone and he'll kill me. I'll be here. I'll be at this spot. You go tell him. And so Ahab comes. And what's the first thing Ahab says when he sees Elijah? Is that you? You who trouble Israel? We've had a 3.5-year drought and it's your fault. No, I'm not the troubler of Israel. You're the cause of trouble in Israel, king. Well, here you have a parallel to that. The world's opinion is that, illustrate it this way. Every year around Christmas, billboards go up around Atlanta, put up by the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And what's the contention on the billboards?
I'm not seeing.
Religion is the source of all the strife, all the problems in the world. Get rid of religion and it'll be a paradise. That's the gist of it. Well, that's what we see here. The world's opinion is religion is the problem. God is the problem. Get rid of God and we wouldn't have any problems. Get rid of God and you wouldn't have any world or any you for that matter. But the resurrection of the witnesses here, what does that give us? That's a you want to talk about Schadenfreude in a more positive sense. The witnesses are not going to stay dead. God is not going to be overrun by wickedness. Christianity is going to survive one way or another. Now, some want to see this as a reference to the resurrection at the end of time. Go back to the images that Paul, for example, gives us of the resurrection. What happens at the end of time? The Lord descends from heaven with a shout, with a voice of the archangel, with a trumpet of God. And then what's the very next thing he says? The dead in Christ shall rise first to meet the Lord in the air. Then we who are alive that are left will be with them, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. So some would take that as a reference to 1 Thessalonians 4:16 through 18. Regardless, notice what happens here. That resurrection of these witnesses is accompanied by a violent earthquake. 7,000 are killed. Well, what's 7,000? That's a number for completeness, perfection, multiplied by a number signaling strength, 10. A tenth of the city is destroyed, not everything. What you have here is not an image of final judgment. Rather, what you have here is an image of God's judgment on the world as it exists in present time. Now, for those Christians at the end of the first century, who would they naturally think of? Well, Rome. That's who's the source of their trouble and their persecution and so forth. If the city here in verse 8, if that's literal Jerusalem, then the earthquake and everything else would have to be interpreted literally as well. But you look here, a third woe is about to be announced. Come to verse 14. The second woe has passed. The third woe is soon to come. And then the seventh angel is going to blow his trumpet. So here we have the stage set. Everything is prepared for the seventh trumpet. And this is going to give us call it a bird's eye view of the rest of Revelation. Now, unlike the seven seals, unlike the first six trumpets, this is not the heralding of dire events. You start at verse 15, the seventh angel blew his trumpet. There were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. The 24 elders who sit on their thrones before God fell on their faces, worshiped God, saying, we give thanks to you, Lord God Almighty, who is, who was, for you have taken your great power and begun to reign. The nations raged, but your wrath came, and the time for the dead to be judged, and for rewarding your servants, the prophets and saints, and those who fear your name, both small and great, and for destroying the destroyers of the earth. Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. What do we see? Praise. Where the other seal, the previous seals and the previous trumpets, every one of them led to some kind of bad thing, dire consequences. This trumpet sounds, and now there's praise in heaven. Praise among God's people. A multitude of heavenly voices. And the 24 elders that we've already seen, where are they? They're falling down before him in worship. Now, where does this passage look? It seems to look forward to ultimate judgment. It would appear to, from heaven's perspective, after all, what God has ordained is already done. There is no future, no past from God's perspective. When God told Moses, Moses said, well, who should I say sent me? Who did God say to tell them? I am that I am hath sent you, the eternally present one. Time, our concept of time, past, present, future, who was, who is yet to come. That's something God allows us so that we understand in some small way concept of eternity. How does David describe it? from everlasting to everlasting, thou art God. There's no limit, no boundary to God, and God doesn't have past and present and future. God has present, present, present. He sees the end from the beginning because the end is as near to him as the beginning. It's in the present from his perspective. So, at verse 15, the world that left God is going to be reclaimed and judged by him. You have the fulfillment of the last part of Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44 here. God rules in the kingdoms of men and gives them to whomsoever he wills, and he will raise up in that day a kingdom that shall break in pieces all that go before it, all that have come before it. What did Jesus say in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 18? We know Matthew 16, 18.
Yeah.
Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and what's the rest of it say? The gates of hell, the gates of Hades, the power of death, basically, shall not prevail against it. So, in many modern English translations, the New American Standard, the Revised Standard, the NIV, God is no longer described as who is to come. That term does appear in the King James and in the New King James, as it does in chapter 1, verse 8, chapter 4, verse 8. Now, if we are seeing here, and I know our time is up, if we are seeing here in this passage from an eternal perspective, then that concept of the future really is not applicable because we're being shown from God's perspective. We're allowed to see here as God sees. It's all accomplished. It's all done. Now, our time is up. We need to stop here. I didn't quite get to the end of this. We'll come back and pick this up next week and look at chapters 12 and 13 and possibly 14. If you look at the syllabus, tonight is the night for the midterm, but we're a little bit behind, and so we'll defer that until we have looked at least at the introductory material to chapters 12, 13, and 14. So expect the midterm next week, and that will be a take-home test, and you'll have a week to complete it and return. Questions, comments, or thoughts before we dismiss? All right. We will stop the recording here.